She called 911 and the person who answered was not a police officer. Hello? Her 8-year-old voice trembled. Is this 911? It sure is, the cheerful male voice on the other end of the phone line answered. What's the trouble, young lady? She frowned. Young lady? Wasn't he supposed to say 911? What's your emergency? Something seemed wrong, but she brushed it off. She assumed maybe it was his first day, but she could have never guessed the horrifying truth of who she was actually talking to. Either way, there was no time to waste. Something's wrong with my mom. She fell down all of a sudden. Her mother lay where she collapsed just minutes ago. Oh no, that's too bad. Someone will be over right away. Click. She then dropped the phone and hurried over to her mother. The faint rise and fall of her chest was the only way that she knew that she was even alive. Wait, she hadn't told the dispatcher her address. How would they not think to ask that? She ran back to the phone and dialed 911 again. 151 Cliffmore Way! 151 Cliffmore Way! She shouted into the receiver and then hung up. She shut her eyes tight. She wanted to scream, to shatter into a million pieces like the glass that had fallen from her mother's grasp just before she collapsed. But all she could do was wait, hold her hand, and pray. It felt like an eternity before the doorbell finally rang. She sprang to her feet but froze when she turned the corner. A short, brown-haired man was peering through the window with a grin on his face. He rang the bell again, this time more insistently, and she noticed he wore a red nurse's uniform. She let out a sigh of relief. The ambulance people were here. Everything was gonna be okay. She yanked the door open. Hello there, young lady, the smiling man exclaimed. She read the name Marbus on his name tag right beside the pens and the stethoscope. Where's the unlucky lady? He asked. You mean my mom? She stammered. She's in here. Two expressionless assistants in identical red uniforms rolled a gurney to where her mother lay, surrounded by shards of glittering glass. Up, and away! Nurse Marbus rubbed his hands together excitedly while her mother was loaded into a gurney and rolled out the door. A jolt of helpless fear shot through her. They were taking her mother away. Mister, can I ride with my mom to the hospital? She asked the smiling man. Hospital? Nurse Marbus wrinkled his forehead in confusion. Oh, there's no need for that. We're professionals, you see. As the assistants loaded her mother into the back of the black ambulance, she looked over their shoulders at the sharp and jagged tools hanging from its walls. They weren't like any medical instruments that she'd ever seen, but she was 8 years old. We'll take excellent care of your mother, the smiling man went on, and call you as soon as you can see her. Nurse Marbus leaped into the rear compartment. His expressionless assistants climbed into the cab, and the black ambulance began to back out of the driveway. She ran behind it, waving her hands. She wanted to yell at them to stop, but she was just a kid. She was still standing there 5 minutes later when flashing red and blue lights came skidding around the street corner. Two police officers then muttered into the radios and looked worriedly at the scene in front of them. A crying child, a wide open door. Did you call 911? A blonde policewoman asked. She nodded. But they already came. They took my mom away. The two police officers looked at each other. I'm afraid that's not possible. We received a call from this location, a child shouting an address, and we're the first ones to respond, the male officer replied. These words spun around in her head. If they were the first ones here, then who had taken her mom? No, she whispered, her heart racing. Then who was... Before she could even finish, the policewoman pulled up her radio again. We need an immediate trace on a black ambulance that just left 151 Cliffmore Way. Suspects are potentially dangerous. The other officer crouched down to her level, his eyes searching hers. Can you describe the man who came to your door? He asked. Nurse Marbus, she muttered, remembering the name tag. He wore a red uniform and had two assistants, and their van was full of weird tools. The officers' faces turned ashen as they exchanged a fearful glance. Nurse Marbus, the policewoman repeated into her radio, her voice cracking. The female officer then began to frantically search her records on a small device, her hands shaking. The male officer continued to speak with the little girl, but his eyes were wide with shock. They worked in panicked coordination, reaching out to other units and checking databases. Until finally, the policewoman looked up at her partner, her face white as a sheet, her voice trembling as she started to talk. The name Marbus belongs to a man who used to work for the city's medical services, but he died in a terrible accident over 20 years ago. The details were horrifying, and it was said that he had been conducting some unlicensed experiments. Her heart now pounded in her ears as she processed her words. Dead? What's gonna happen to my mom? She asked, tears welling in her eyes. I just want her back. We're gonna do everything we can to find her, the male officer assured her, but she could see the fear in his eyes. 6 full years had then passed since the fateful day when her mother disappeared. Now 14, she still felt the weight of that day. Then, unexpectedly, she received a phone call. She heard the ringing on her landline and ran over to it, hearing a deep male voice. Hello, young lady. Everything is going to be just fine. She sends her love. That was all he said before ending the call. At least the evil man had the decency to check in after all this time. She told the police, she told her family, she did everything she possibly could to somehow locate this number back to her mother. But there was nothing that could be done. The police spent weeks trying to locate where the call came from, but they couldn't. She had to do something herself. Feeling helpless and desperate, she eventually turned to hiring a private investigator, hoping someone outside the conventional system might have more success. The investigator she hired was a middle-aged man named Leonard, who had a reputation for being able to find people when no one else could. After a few weeks, Leonard finally got back to her with the lead. He managed to reverse the phone number, pinpointing it to a landline that was located in a large commercial building on the outskirts of the city. Interestingly though, there were no public records indicating any business or residence at that address. Knowing the police would be no use, the two decided to take a trip to the location. It was a cold night. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, plunging the world into an eerie darkness. Despite the entire building looking completely abandoned, behind the building she did notice a few large waste bins. Out of curiosity, she approached one of them and found a discarded envelope with the logo imprinted. The logo read Lustrum Pharmaceuticals. She showed it to Leonard and he raised an eyebrow. Lustrum Pharmaceuticals went under a long time ago, he murmured. They were rumored to be involved in some shady experimental treatments. The information was enough to finally bring the police back into the fold. They returned to the station and presented everything to the detectives, including the logo and its findings. They were skeptical at first, but when they realized that the clues pointed towards a defunct company linked to illegal practices, they took it more seriously. After 6 years, she finally had a chance of getting her mother back. Or so she thought. If only she had known the horrible things that nurse had done to her mother. They organized a raid, gathering a SWAT team and other officers to infiltrate the building. The now teenage girl was not allowed to accompany them, but she insisted on waiting outside the police barricade, filled with a mixture of hope and dread. Hours dragged by as she waited, Leonard by her side, his experienced eyes watching the whole operation unfold. Until finally, in the early morning, the door of the building burst open and the officers began to escort people out. Most were in handcuffs, members of a twisted organization responsible for taking her mother. And then, finally, she saw her. She was frail and weak, her face pale and her eyes filled with a haunted expression. But she was alive. Officers guided her carefully, placing her into an ambulance. A lump then formed in the teenage girl's throat as she rushed towards her, tears cascading down her cheeks. "Mom?" she uttered softly, excitement beginning to bubble within her. As her mother turned, their eyes met. A flicker of recognition and love passed between them. Then in a hushed tone, her mother whispered, "Who are you?"